Joining me now is the Director of Defence Strategy and National Security at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Michael Shoebridge. Michael, great to see you tonight. What did you make of yesterday's National Press Club appearance by the senior Chinese diplomat?
Well, I thought we had the urbane, sophisticated diplomat instead of the ambassador who's the wolf warrior, rip your heart out and show it to you kind of diplomat. But really, despite the more urbane wrapping, it was the same message from the Deputy Ambassador, just delivered slightly more politely. Although one of the funniest things to me was him characterising China as Julius Caesar and Australia as Brutus. Because if I remember that play by Shakespeare, the reason Julius Caesar was killed is because he was exercising tyrannical power over others and he had gathered a whole lot of resistance against him. Well, if that's what the Deputy Ambassador was characterising Beijing as doing, I think he's on the money.
Michael, it was a fairly colourful speech. There was, analogies here and analogies there. One of the analogies was about, China and Australia being in a bad marriage, and they were the ones who were being abused. And yet, the general consensus, and, I saw Greg Sheridan's terrific piece in today's Australian. I mean, he basically said it was farcical. He was like a 1950s Eastern Bloc Soviet Apacheek sort of standing there saying there aren't any Russian guards in Prague.
Yes, well, it reminded me of Saddam Hussein's communications minister, who was busily denying that any American forces were anywhere in Iraq when a large US Bradley fighting vehicle motored past him. The problem is that the Deputy Ambassador's words just don't match Beijing's actions. He wasn't honest about the coercion around wine, barley and beef, and it was delightful that he ate Australian wine, barley and beef. There was nothing under heaven that Beijing is doing that's aggressive or expansionist. Hong Kong clearly wasn't on his agenda. Neither was Xinjiang, neither was the South China Sea, or large-scale cyber hacking, including of our parliament. None of that seemed to be relevant to him. It was all about the victim and the victim noticing that the perpetrator was Beijing.
Michael, interestingly, today the Prime Minister very, very bolshy on this Belt and Road Initiative of the Andrews government, and we just heard Daniel Andrews getting somewhat shirty at the prospect of federal intervention on that particular issue. What are your concerns about the Belt and Road Initiative between the Andrews government and Beijing?
Well, it's very simple and it's all on the public record from the Chinese government. So I really don't know why Premier Andrews doesn't understand this. And he keeps talking about it as it's all some lovely jobs agenda where Beijing wants to employ more Victorians in prosperity. The Chinese government has said that the Belt and Road Initiative is part of China's growing strategic, technological and economic power, and it's a way for Xi to make other countries more dependent on China and China less dependent on them. This is all on the public record. And I know Premier Andrews keeps saying national security is not his responsibility and he can't understand why the Prime Minister is so worried about it. Well, that's because it is the Prime Minister's responsibility, and the fact that that Andrews doesn't understand it should make him listen to the federal government. So I find it breathtaking that the willful blindness that we see from the Victorian Premier is persisting, leaving the federal government with no option but to make the Victorian government do by law what it should do in our national interest.
What's the latest on the World Health Organization inquiry into the origins of coronavirus? I mean, one of the areas that we keep hearing from China that they're so angry with Australia about is our championing of an independent inquiry. And as I said in my opener, Michael, it's pretty common sense, isn't it? We just want to find out how it happened, why it happened, and make sure it doesn't happen again. Are you hearing any advances in that particular investigation?
I think we'll hear more in September when the World Health Organization's executive board meets and it gets the initial report from the inquiry, which has New Zealand's former Prime Minister Helen Clark as one of the co-leaders of that. But I think the first public exposure will be at the World Health Assembly meeting, which is later this year. And that'll just be the initial report. But really, my expectations are low when it comes to Chinese government cooperation. I think openness about forensic data, openness about the Chinese government's actions, including in Wuhan early on, will be low. And Beijing will talk up cooperation. And it'll be fascinating to see whether the WHO is a bit more honest and open about the limits of Chinese cooperation. The Deputy Ambassador was quite amusing on this, really, because at the same time as he said how upset 1.4 billion Chinese people were that people should want to find out how the pandemic happened and stop future ones, he also had to admit that China had ended up having to support the inquiry that Australia called for. So you've got to wonder how they square that circle.
Michael, before we go, we've got Bob Katter coming up after the break, and he'll be talking about his resolution that will go to federal parliament on Monday, where he is calling for an inquiry into Chinese influence and interference into Australian universities, which I think will be a compelling inquiry because there seems to be fairly obvious, I would have thought, interference in Australian universities by the Chinese right now.
Yes, there is in two big ways. Research partnerships with Chinese institutions that are either parts of the Chinese military or have close working connections with the Chinese military or their internal security apparatus. And then these talent programs where many Australian researchers and scientists are engaged in giving the fruits of their intellect and research to China, and on occasion without even letting their home institution here in Australia know. So these foreign relations laws the Prime Minister is going to introduce into Parliament will also catch universities in this way. And again, a lot of this can be fixed by the universities being transparent with the Australian public and the federal government. But Bob Katter is right. There should be a parliamentary inquiry, and these actions and relationships between China and our universities need to be exposed.
Michael Shoebridge, always a pleasure to have you on Sky News Across Australia. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much, Peter.